Good. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Sustainable Living Series webinar. Today we have Nathan Splinter, Manager of Energy Sustainability and the Central Heating Plant at Queen's University. He's going to be talking about the projects that enabled over 35% reduction in university greenhouse gas emissions and the progress report that lays out new projects that are underway. So without further ado, please welcome Nathan Splinter.
Thanks, Marlo. Appreciate the introduction. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay. Feel free to raise your hand or interrupt me at any point through the presentation if you do have a question. I'm more than happy to sort of stop and talk through any of the things that I'm talking about in more context, or if you have a question you're not sure, feel free to stop and ask a question. You don't have to save it till the end. As Marlo mentioned, I'm the Manager of Energy Sustainability, CHP, and Refrigeration. I'm going to start off the presentation with a acknowledgement of the land in which we're situated on, and just finding some things here. Okay, so we acknowledge that Queens is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. And one of the things I always like to talk about is the fact that Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous culture has a really strong correlation to sustainability concepts that we strive for today. Decolonization, for example, has a really interesting tie to sustainable landscapes and, how we view the campus that we live on, and whether or not we can bring naturalization back into it, which is obviously sort of a key concept of Indigenous ways of knowing. So without further ado, I'll sort of jump into the agenda here. So what I was hoping to cover today is provide some awareness and understanding of what the Climate Action Plan is that was adopted by the University Board of Trustees. Talk about those targets, talk about the results, including our 2020, but also our 2021 results. Dive into the detail a little bit on how we achieve them, and then talk a little bit about where we see our projects and initiatives going in the future to obtain and achieve our future goals within that action plan. And at the end, if there's questions, we can address them then, but happy to stop at any point as well. So I always like to start off with greenhouse gases. It can be a bit of a nebulous concept. And really what we're talking about is pollution and emissions from different sources, either combustion or industrial processes that end up in the environment and in the air that we so critically need. And so the greenhouse gases specific that we talk about when we talk about GHGs or carbon, in some cases people use the word carbon interchangeably, is methane, nitrous dioxide, carbon dioxide, ozone, and the things that we call fluorocarbons, which are primarily refrigerants, and then carbon monoxide and sulfur dioxide are some of the products of combustion. So where do these greenhouse gases emanate from? And so when we talk about the different types of emissions that happen, we can talk a little bit about the sources of them. And so you can see here carbon dioxide, which makes up about 81% of emissions in 2018. So in the province of Ontario, carbon dioxide was responsible for 81% of the emissions, and that's strictly related to combustion. So combustion of natural gas, combustion of fossil fuels in cars, trucks, and then industrial processes and heating. The other really big one is methane, and methane comes from decomposition as well as agriculture. And so those are the big components there. So waste treatment systems, and then also agricultural processes. Nitrous oxide is primarily from industrial processes, and fluorinated gases are primarily from refrigeration and cooling. So of all the emissions that occurred and this is the last year we had good data from it. The current government doesn't publish much data in Ontario, and this gives you a breakdown of where those originated. To sort of further break down, like I talked about before, which individual sectors are responsible for a lot of the emissions. You can see transportation actually makes up 38%, which is the largest single sector for emissions in Ontario. And then buildings are after that with industry. And so you can see that of the sort of, if you add transportation and buildings together, you get a significant component of the pie, which correlates to the carbon dioxide emissions that I showed in the last slide. And then the next ones are sort of around waste, other non-energy, and industry. So what does all that mean? Why is it a big deal? Who cares about emissions? We do, but the reason that we need to be concerned about emissions is because of the greenhouse gas effect, or the greenhouse effect that happens. And so as we have more of these global warming gases that are emitted and reside in our atmosphere, what happens is there's less heat that's escaping out into space. And so as we sort of increase the amount of greenhouse gases, we will see a warming effect that happens. And then, climate change is a component of that. And then climate variability. So larger storms, wildfires, hot events, cold events, rain events, just the variability of the natural environment as it responds to that. So that's why it's extremely important. I like to sort of bring back to the context of how the university operates and some of the things we do and how we manage and use our energy on campus. So what you're seeing here is a picture of the central heating plant on the left hand of the screen. The large stack that exists out in front of the hospital is actually the Queen's-owned central heating plant, and it provides steam heating out to the about 75 of the large buildings on campus. Just about every single building on campus is heated via steam. And that's one of the things that we're working to sort of drive efficiency within. The middle picture is out at West Campus, and you can see Jean Royce Hall in the background. And that's where we actually took the steam system out of service. And what you're seeing is new high temperature hot water piping going in. And so hot water systems are more efficient than steam. And so we transitioned that whole precinct over from steam to hot water, which was a pretty interesting project. And so what you're seeing on the top right is an electrical distribution system, and Queen's operates our own electricity network, and it's about the equivalent of 10,000 homes of electricity that we use on an annualized basis. So it is a very significant amount of electricity, and we have our own distribution network as well for that. And in the bottom, you see it's called a cogeneration unit. It's essentially a jet engine that's located in the central heating plant, and it has the ability to produce both power and steam. And it's used primarily for emergency situations such as the 2003 blackout or the 1998 ice storm, where we had long-term power issues. And so we have two of those units, and one alone can power the entire hospital, and the second one can power about a third to a half of the entire university. So we use those for long-term emergency heat and power. So hopefully that provides you a little bit of context to just sort of how big the system is. We have about 20 kilometers of steam piping, and the heating that we use is about the equivalent of 6,000 homes. So it's a pretty significant infrastructure. The next thing I like to talk about is the scopes of emissions. And so when we talk about emissions, we break them down into three categories, and that allows us to manage and report on them without double reporting or double counting our emissions. And so the scope of emission depends on the reference point of the user. of the fuels and the sources. So I'll give you some examples. A scope 1 emission is typically an emission that occurs directly on your facility, or, in the case of an individual, it would be in your home. So if you have a central heating system like a furnace, and it's say powered by natural gas, the emissions from that natural gas furnace would be considered scope 1. You probably have electricity in your home, and you can control how much electricity you use, but you can't really control the emissions associated with it. And so it's called scope 2 because the emissions associated with it are outside of your control, but the usage of it is. Scope 3 is anything along the lines of purchased goods, travel, and the embodied energy of products and materials that you buy. So as you choose to buy products, whether they be made by plastic or perhaps from a renewable resource instead, they would have different values of embodied carbon. Also, where they're manufactured is quite important, as the scope 3 emissions associated with a product that was made in a jurisdiction such as Ontario with a clean electricity grid, if that product was made with electricity versus a product that was made, say in Alberta, which has primarily gas and coal-fired power, the emissions associated with that product are different, even though the product is the exact same product. So hopefully that gives you a sense on that. Are there any questions about the scopes of emissions? Okay, hearing none, I'll move on. So now you sort of understand the different scopes of emissions. So how did we set out a management plan or an action plan to try and address the emissions associated with the university's emissions or pollution, if we're honest about it? And it was a collaborative process, involved quite a bit of stakeholdering. It started in 2010 when Principal Wolf signed the University College and University and College President's Climate Change Statement of Action for Canada. So a really long word, but basically it committed the university to creating a plan. And in 2016, that plan was formally approved by the Board of Trustees for the university. So this plan is adopted in a formal document for the university, and it laid out a target for 2040 to be net zero, with interim targets in 2020 and 2030 of reducing our emissions to 35% from our 2008 baseline and 70% from our 2008 baseline, and then obtaining net zero by 2040. So that was the goals, the outcome goals of the project. And so I'm going to dive into a little bit on sort of how we have tracked and how we've done with that. So every year, my office creates a pretty extensive greenhouse gas inventory, and we publish it annually. You can go onto the facilities website, and if you search under energy and sustainability, you'll be able to find our reports section where we've got the greenhouse gas inventories listed. And so we've been doing these since 2008, and we've reported all the way up to 2021. And next year we will report on our 2022 emissions. And so how have we been doing? Quite well. So this graph shows you the emissions from 2008 all the way to 2021. And you can see that our original emissions, and we add up the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions to give us a total. And you'll notice that the scope 1 emissions are adjusted. And the reason they're adjusted is, as I mentioned about the central heating plant that we have, we do send steam and energy to the hospital. And so when we're calculating our scope 1 emissions, which are emissions from that heating plant, we back out the portion that is responsible for heating the hospital. So this is, it's just the emissions that are associated with the university. And so you can see that in general, the emissions have actually gone down over the course of the last 22 years. And you can see what's interesting is that for the scope 2 emissions have primarily decreased and gotten smaller over time, but the scope 1 emissions have fluctuated a little bit. And these increases correspond with new construction, as well as changes to, and they've decreased with respect to energy conservation projects that we've enabled. So one of the things that I'll show you on the next slide is that we continue to build new buildings on campus. And so it's important to take in context that the emissions, when we track them and we set targets, they're absolute values. So we are aiming to we don't divide them out by any particular, metric. So we don't say, oh, well, we're bigger than we were last year, so therefore we're still doing better. No, we try and our target is absolute. So it doesn't matter if the university grows, we still have to decrease our emissions. And so the red line that you see in this graph is actually the increasing campus area. And so as we build new buildings, we just opened up a new residence. We had Mitchell Hall come online. We're redeveloping the JDUC right now. We're continually building and adding new construction. There's a pavilion that's going up out at the Richardson Stadium. And so every time we add additional buildings, that's those have direct correlations to how much energy we use, because each building additionally is going to use more energy. And so being thoughtful about how we use that energy and what type of energy we use is quite important. I'm just going to go back one slide because there was one thing I wanted to mention. One of the reasons that the scope 2 emissions have gone down, which if you're listening, I mentioned the scope 2 emissions are from electricity. And so the electricity in the province of Ontario has gotten a lot cleaner. We had a phase out of coal that happened sort of between 2011 and I think it was finally fully we were off of coal in around 2013, 2014. And that's why you see this big decrease in our scope 2 emissions, even though we've actually increased our electrical use over time. And utilizing electricity for our heating needs instead of fossil fuels will be one of the key strategies that we use going forward. So one of the interesting pieces back to this slide is that we do take our emissions and we divide them by our total campus area to kind of see how we're doing. And you can see that we've actually lowered our energy intensity or our emissions intensity on an annualized basis over the years. Are there any questions on that? No. Okay. The charts can sometimes be tough, so I always put in this slide just so that everyone can sort of see. One of the exciting things I got to talk about a lot over the last year and a bit is that we were successful in meeting our 2020 climate action plan target of 35% reduction. I rounded up, so you can see it was 34.56 actually, but I've rounded up to 35% and said we did it. One of the interesting things around the data is that we were trying to figure out whether or not COVID had a big impact on our emissions profile. And I mean, in terms of campus population and people working remotely and how we were operating our buildings, we did make changes and we did actively try to conserve energy over that time period. But we did see, a return to campus in 2021, and we had a lot more activity in campus on 2021, and we increased our ventilation rate significantly. We increased the amount of fresh air that we were bringing into buildings to try and help deal with mitigating the potential for COVID infections and COVID transmission. And so what was interesting in this to me was that we actually decreased in 2021, even though we were doing things that weren't really in line with, the best case practices for energy management, because we were focused more on safety and increasing ventilation rates. And so what it tells us is that the reductions that we've seen, and especially from 2019 to 2020, were real and substantial and ongoing. So so that's really great, and we're interested to see how we close out 2022, because it is such a big campus and we're paying attention to a lot of different moving parts. Sometimes it's a month or two after the year closes before we really understand how the year went in terms of managing those emissions. So so how did we get there? How did we achieve 35% reduction? And if I skip back to the slide, you can see that the baseline was 57,000 metric tons of emissions. So when we do look at our emissions, we like in those gases, you add them up and you weigh them and you create that's why it's metric tons, is because it's the weight of the gas that you're monitoring and measuring. And so you can see that we're aiming to go from about 57,000 tons down to about 37,000 tons. And so that was about a 20,000 ton reduction. And so the 20,000 tons, there was about 10,000 that was from scope 2 and about 10,000 from scope 1. And so the electricity piece was really outside of our control, because we as I mentioned before, the emissions associated with electricity are primarily from producers within the province. So your Ontario Hydro and other producers that are making power through either water, hydro, nuclear, or gas. And that phase out of coal was really what gave us that 10,000 tons of reduction, because we have actually increased our electricity use over the last 22 years. So the 12 years, sorry. And then the next is the 10,000 tons from scope 1. And those were actually from projects that we've been initiated by Queens. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the emissions first. And so one of the things that we've seen over time, as I mentioned, the phase out of coal and the cleaning of the grid and the bringing in of solar. This is a profile of the energy intensity, or the greenhouse gas intensity per kilowatt hour. And so if you want to reduce your emissions at home, in your own home, one of the things you can do is look to electrify and use more electricity. So if you have a natural gas heater, or you could switch to an electric heater, water heater. Or if you have a gas furnace or an oil furnace, you should really look into a heat pump, as they are very efficient, and it's a technology that's been around for a long period of time. It's commercially viable now, and you're not subject to the ups and downs of gas pricing. So as I noted, we've increased electricity use on campus from 2008 to 2020, and that's been about a 20% increase. So then there's the scope 1 projects, and I did say that it was 10,000 tons of the sort of the breakdown of the 20, but it's actually more. And the reason it's actually more is because we've grown over that time from we had that initial investment, or since we set our baseline. So our baseline was set in 2008, and we've added at least 10 buildings since that time. So the reductions that we've actually seen are even higher than that 20,000, and a good significant of them come from projects that we've done. The university has invested over $25 million in projects since 2008, and here's a breakdown of a few of them. So we did decommission the steam line that ran all the way out to West Campus and served 355 King, as well as the Donald Gordon Center and all the buildings at West Campus. We had a big project where we initiated a retrofit across 64 buildings, and that was the ESCO project. And we had a phase out of bunker oil, which we used to use down at the plant. So that was a really big reduction. And you can see that's almost almost like, that's the single largest change that we made that had a huge impact. We've really driven efficiency within our buildings. And then we've had some significant changes. This was a lease space at the time, but we did institute a really big project out at Innovation Park. And then we did have a really warm winter in 2020, but we've proven out that wasn't just the sole reason for our reductions. So talking a little bit more about some of those projects in general, the West Campus steam line decommissioning. If you can see the green line that's here running down, this is the central heating plant down in the bottom right-hand corner. And the green line still exists, and the red line is the steam line that we decommissioned. So it was almost 2.5 kilometers of steam line that we decommissioned. And we put in new independent heating systems out at Donald Gordon Center and St. Mary's of the Lake, are now called 355 King, which Queens has purchased. And also the West Campus, where I showed you some pictures from that. And I've got a few more actually of this project, which are kind of neat. You can see John Orr Tower in the background here. It's also on that system. And the middle picture shows some of the insulation being put on. You can see that distribution piping that I shown before. In the bottom left-hand corner, a few of the gas boilers that are there now. And then a few of the other piping pictures in beside the plant, which now houses those boilers along with a chiller. The interesting part to this project is that we actually had some government funding that was supporting it, and we had to complete the project throughout the winter. So we actually converted the heating system to a new heating system in the middle of winter, which was pretty challenging. But worked out pretty well. This is a new heating plant being put in at Donald Gordon Center. So a whole new building went up there to house the infrastructure to transition over to an independent heating system. And so here you can see some of the footings and formwork going in for that project. And here's a few more of the district distribution piping that runs to and from that boiler house, as well as the finished boiler house itself down in the bottom right. Are there any questions on that? No? Okay. The other thing that we did, as I mentioned before, was the CAPIT program, which was it was an energy services company contract. And so we partnered with Honeywell, and we did retrofit work in 64 buildings. And as I mentioned before, it reduced 2,800 tons, but sometimes that's like a hard thing to kind of get your head around. So 2,800 tons is the equivalent of reducing, not burning 15 full rail cars of coal every year. And so, or it's the equivalent of taking 593 cars off the road. And so, that the rail cars of coal is always one that really kind of sort of sticks with me. Not shown on here is the water conservation that came from doing work with that project too. We reduced our water consumption by 186,000 cubic meters, which is equivalent of filling the Queens Center pool 84 times. Every year. So we reduce water usage by the equivalent of 84 Queen Center pools every year. So it's a pretty significant project. It had about $1 million a year payback. So it was about a 10-year payback. And the project also received about $800,000 in government incentives. But other than that, it was a fully Queens funded project. So pretty significant investment by the university to drive efficiency within our buildings. At Innovation Park, Queens had a significant lease agreement in place with there, and we executed a $2.5 million project that had a 5-year payback, and we converted they used to have a cooling system that was actually steam driven, and we replaced all that with electric. so fully electric, and it also brought it all off of natural gas fired steam, which was great. So they didn't need to run a boiler in the summer to make chilled water, which was a really odd arrangement for them to have. We replaced all of the lighting, and we did a full ventilation upgrade in the building. And we also had a really significant water conservation project there that saved, I think it was, I want to say it was 100 cubic meters a day. So it was very significant in terms of the water conservation that we achieved there. So what are we doing now? We are just in the middle to close to wrapping up a fume hood project, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. And we kind of look at three different ways of sort of managing our emissions going forward. The one is that we have to have sustainable design. And so that's where you see the LEED symbol down below. We also require all new builds to be geothermal. And so in order to make sure that we don't add to our carbon footprint, we have to design buildings that don't do that when they go up. And that's primarily making sure that their electrification occurs within the building design, and that we design buildings with extremely efficient envelopes and with green technology built into the actual project. The next thing we do is we look at utilizing energy within the buildings as efficiently as possible. And so that comes down to our building automation platforms and making sure that equipment is operating and running when it needs to and at its peak performance. And so that's a big component of what the facilities team here on Queens does. And then the last one is looking at our district energy system. And some of that will be, transitioning off of steam and or looking at different ways to make that steam. There are some universities that are actually pursuing electric boilers and keeping a steam system. And so that'll be one of the things that we look at in future years. Our Vice Principal of Finance Administration, Donna Janiak, just talked yesterday about a project that we're working on to look at a series of different options for us to look at our district energy system and transitioning that to a greener and less carbon intensive solution. I did want to talk about the strategic lab revitalization because it is a project we have underway right now. We're mid construction right now. We've got 4 buildings that we're working on. Chernoff Hall, New Meds, and we talk about biosciences, but biosciences actually contains 2 buildings. It's Earl Hall and then the actual biosciences building. So the primary focus of that project is fume hoods. Oh, sorry. Is fume hoods and right sizing those fume hoods so that they're operating to their original design intent, as well as installing heat recovery in a couple of the buildings as well. So we're going to recollect energy that's leaving the building through the exhaust system and bring it back into the side that's supplying fresh air into the building. So it's a significant project. It's going to bring almost 2,000 tons of estimated reduction. And this project was funded out of utility savings to the tune of $5.5 million. So again, the university is putting forward significant investment to drive down our carbon emissions. We currently have a building automation platform that allows us to see what's happening in real time in the majority of our buildings, but we aren't yet using it, I think, to our fullest potential. And so you can see the University of Iowa has a really neat energy control center, and that'll be something that we look to develop here at the university and increase the amount of our real-time monitoring. Right now, we're typically responding to alarms and looking in when we into buildings when we know that there's issues and conditions, but we're a bit more reactive than proactive. And so that's where we'll look to take things in the future. We just need to prove out some of the resourcing and obtain funding for that. As I mentioned before, we really need to make sure that our building design is setting us up for success in terms of making sure that any new build that happens is a low carbon intensity building. And one of the things, the way that we'll do that is ensuring that all new builds going forward are geothermal. And our first building is now up and operational. That was is geothermal, and that was our new shared services building at 355 King, which is just we're in the middle of between West Campus and Main Campus. As I mentioned before, the district energy study is going to be a really big initiative that we'll be undertaking, and we'll see traction on that in the coming year. There'll be a stakeholder group that's developed, and from that stakeholder group, an RFP will be developed, and we'll be engaging with consultants and experts, as well as the campus community, to talk about where we go from here for heating and cooling the university. And so that brings to the end of my presentation. I think I'll stop sharing, but I do have a couple of links up here for the facilities, energy and waste management site, as well as Sustainable Queens. Both have really great resources on them. So
Go ahead, Zabe.
Can you hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Sorry, I've been having computer issues, so I might have missed this, anything, but I work at West Campus, so I was aware. I've been here since you guys removed the pipes, because I used to see all the steam being released from them from Main Campus. But can you just confirm that Main Campus, what heats the water? Is it natural gas?
At West Campus?
No, on Main Campus. Actually, both.
Yeah, they're so on Main Campus we have a steam system, and it's heated with natural gas. And
Okay.
At West Campus we have a hot water system, which is also heated with natural gas. But we have plans, and we've looked at design alternatives as well for West Campus. So if the tower project moves forward, that's going to be a geothermal project. And on a long-term basis, we'll see a transition of the hot water system to a lower temperature system at West Campus, but it would be a geothermal system.
Okay, so be a little bit aware of the new build, and that it is going to get a geothermal heat pump. And I'm curious, again, because it was put on hold for a year because of the economy, why the geothermal part could not be continued, knowing that even if the new build never happened, that the rest of the building could be converted. Basically, if we're aiming for electricity, heating and cooling systems, why would we not put in place, while the work is being done, a heat pump system that would work for the whole West Campus instead of just the new addition?
Are you talking about why it wasn't done, or why wouldn't it now?
I haven't heard of.
Oh, we lost Zabi there, I think. So I mean, at the end of the day, the university has limited funds, and so there's always competition for dollars and investment. So in general, what we do is we look at where from a dollar invested, where can we have the biggest impact on emissions and on emissions reductions within the university. And so, for example, the $5.5 million that was invested into the strategic lab revitalization, that was because that, when we look at, it's called a marginal cost abatement curve. And when you develop one of those, you look at a whole series of different infrastructure investments, and you look at which one is actually going to provide you the biggest return for what it is that you're trying to achieve. And so if it's carbon reductions, then usually you would be looking at projects that will reduce that significantly. And at West Campus, it's actually a pretty high efficiency natural gas system, even though it's hot water, but it's brand new and it's quite high efficiency. And so there's other locations that we can invest the dollars and have a larger impact. So we don't really pick and choose from site to site. We sort of look at where can we have the largest impact. Are there any other questions? Quiet group. I must have done a really good job with the presentation. You're all now experts.
Sorry, can I, this is Abby again. My computer keeps freezing. It's frozen about 15 times. So I totally missed your answer to the heat pump issue on West Campus. Can you again repeat it? I'm on right now and.
Sure. So I'll just give a quick
Yeah.
review. Essentially what we do is what's called a marginal abatement cost curve, and we look at all the different types of projects. We have a big master list of all the different types of projects that we have that we could initiate. And we look at the dollars invested versus the impact of it. So if we can find a lower carbon reduction investment elsewhere, that's where we're going to petition to spend the money. And so the system out at West Campus is actually quite efficient. And, you know, all new piping, well insulated and high efficiency boilers that are there now. It would be a hard business case to invest the dollars there when we have other opportunities such as the strategic lab revitalization, where we can have 2,000 tons of reduction for $5.5 million. And we just wouldn't see that kind of similar reduction for the same cost investment for a geothermal system out at West. So it's not to say that we wouldn't do it. It's just that we always stand up all of our projects against each other and then pick the best. Or the highest impact, I guess you would say.
Thank you.
I see Melissa has a question.
I'm just curious if there's any conversations around any potential for wind or more solar. I know they come at a cost, but is there any thoughts on that in the future or?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a small wind turbine up on Walter Light, which is a testing one, and it's a horizontal blade wind turbine. For the most part, there are some City of Kingston bylaws that make it difficult for us to install wind. We're actually have a civil engineering group re-looking at a previous study that we did around solar, and so we'll have a pretty good sense on that in terms of the viability, but there's limited places where we can put it. And the last time we ran the cost scenarios, we could reduce our, and the university put $3.5 million into lighting retrofits. And so we've got a project that's ongoing right now, and we're retrofitting the lighting in 20 buildings. So it's a significant project, and that investment will reduce more electricity than we could produce if we bought solar panels. So we're always kind of looking, does it make sense to reduce our energy, or does it make sense to produce it with another form? The supply mix in Ontario is already pretty significantly, you know, solar is significant producer, wind is a very significant producer, and then you have hydro and nuclear, which from an emission standpoint, I know there's contention around nuclear in terms of its like from a sustainability standpoint, but in terms of direct emissions into the environment, it's deemed to be low carbon. And so essentially we can reduce more electricity use by $1 invested than we can with $1 invested in solar PV at this point. But as I said, we've got a study underway to look and question that and see if the numbers still are what we think they are. So we continually look at these and say, is this right? And then the other piece is that we wrote into the building standards that we require all new construction to have rooftops that are capable of carrying solar panels. So at the time when it does come, that it's viable and it's something that we want to pursue from an investment standpoint and an impact standpoint to our carbon emissions. that we'll be ready and we'll have buildings that are capable of supporting that infrastructure. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And I guess like making the decisions now for what's feasible, like you said, dollar for dollar. And then as we get to the net zero, we can't just reduce, we have to eliminate, right? So
Yep.
thank you so much.
Yeah, in general, we typically have been focused on reducing we focus on the ventilation and heating side because that's how we can reduce fossil fuels, and our scope 2 emissions, which are electricity, it's not as big of an issue with respect to, we're looking to use more electricity in most cases because it's much cleaner than fossil fuel use. So I see Matt has a question.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. Really good presentation, by the way. I just had some questions around the emission inventory data itself. I know you had a few different slides with a few different numbers. Just as I was watching it, to derive those numbers, is it purely like a mathematical type engagement, or like using square meter footage, construction materials, energy scope type? Or is there more like sensor data involved in producing some of those numbers, or both?
Yeah, it's not averages. It's actual data. So for the most part, a bunch of our data comes from usually from invoices, which is directly metered energy use, be it natural gas or electricity. And so we have a really good database and really robust process for collecting all of the specific data around how many cubic meters of gas and water and kilowatt hours of electricity we use. And then there's prescribed rates that you're used, and there's actually quite a bit of audited, and some of our emission data that we submit to the province is actually third-party audited. And a lot of it, and there's formulaic approaches. So if you've put this much gas, like this many cubic meters of gas into a boiler, then there's a prescribed value for how many grams or kilograms of emissions of each type that come from that combustion process. And that's all been sort of vetted through like scientific metering and monitoring. Now, I mean, there's a bit of an average there because not every appliance burns at the same rate, but for the most part, it's pretty, I'd say it's a high accuracy, and it's not based on estimates or averages.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah, the carbon footprint report gets into quite a bit of detail. So if you are interested, have a look at that. And if you still have questions, reach out to our team. It's all publicly available.
Any more questions? If you think of something later, I'm sure can always reach out, email Nathan or myself. And if you want to look back at this presentation, it's being recorded, and I'm going to post it to our Sustainable Queens website under our Sustainable Living Series section. So also take a look at the upcoming Sustainable Living Series, because we still have one more in December and then one coming up in January. But come to the end of our time for today. Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you, Nathan. And everyone, enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.